Good morning. Wonderful to see everyone. I want to first give a huge thank you to Lou Weiner and also to Elisa and Zach for the wonderful brunch and opportunity for people to come together this morning. It really was so nice. I know sometimes people come in. We have several people who come in, Marcia and Marjorie, not calling anyone out, and come in and sit early and are here. And it's actually a nice opportunity for us to get together and connect before we engage in some thinking and opportunity to learn together. So thank you again for that wonderful opportunity this morning. For those who might not know me, I'm Rabbi Sue Shankman, and it gives me great pride to welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. I'd like to also welcome those who are joining us on the live stream this morning. As many of you know, the Amram Scholar Series offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, theologians, and journalists share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954, when the congregation moved to our now Macomb Street home. In that fall, participating in a nationwide celebration that marked the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. Today's lecture is in partnership with the Jewish Book Council, and so we encourage you to purchase the book that will be available following the program, and you'll be able to have the opportunity to have the book signed as well. So I am delighted this morning to welcome Graciela Mochkofsky to Washington Hebrew. She was appointed the Dean of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism of the City University of New York by the CUNY Board of Trustees on June 27, 2022. So as we talked about, we both came into our current positions just around the same time, so it's nice to have that in common. She is the third dean since the school opened in 2006. She officially assumed the position on August 1st as the only Latina at the helm of a graduate school of journalism in the United States. Mochkofsky joined the Newmark J School in 2016 to launch the nation's first bilingual master's journalism concentration in English and Spanish. 3 years later, she added the Center for Community Media to her portfolio, serving as executive director to an enterprise that supports hundreds of news outlets covering immigrants and communities of color across the country. Under Ms. Mochkofsky's leadership, the Newmark J School trained 6 cohorts of bilingual journalists who are working in newsrooms across the country. She also hosted 5 Latino media summits, both in person and remotely, conceived and developed separate Latino, Black, and Asian media initiatives, and led a groundbreaking project that helped New York community media receive $25 million in city advertising in the first 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic. All the while, she's continued her journalistic work as a writer for the Paris Review, The Atlantic, and The New Yorker, where she produces a monthly column on Latinx culture and politics. A native of Argentina, she is a winner of the 2018 Maria Moores Cabot Prize for outstanding reporting across Latin America and the Caribbean. She was a political correspondent with La Nación in Argentina, has been a columnist and blogger for El País in Spain, and a contributor to publications in Latin America, Europe, and the US, including the California Sunday Magazine, the New Yorker Online, and the Paris Review blog. She is the author of 6 nonfiction books in Spanish, 2 of them about the relationship between press and political power in her home country. The book she will share with us today, The Prophet of the Andes, An Unlikely Journey to the Promised Land, is about a Peruvian Catholic community that, spoiler alert for those who have not yet read the book, hopefully you all will, a community that converted to Orthodox Judaism and emigrated to the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Mochkofsky has served as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, a Prince Foundation Fellow at the Center for Jewish History, a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at New York University, and a visiting scholar at the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Public Life at Columbia University. She has taught undergraduate courses in reporting and writing and investigative and literary journalism in Buenos Aires, and she has lectured at Princeton, the CUNY Graduate Center, NYU's Institute for the Humanities, and many other universities. Ms. Mochkofsky has also served as a juror for the Gabriel Garcia Marquez Foundation Journalism Prize, Latin America's most important journalism award. She sits on the boards of Report for America, Radio Ambulante, and the Type Media Center, and is a member of the advisory circle of the American Journalism Project. She earned her bachelor's in journalism and communication at Universidad del Salvador in Buenos Aires, and has an MS in journalism from the Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. And if she wasn't accomplished enough, I'm very excited that this is her first appearance as a US citizen, because yesterday morning she took and passed her citizenship exam. And as she could probably share with you, probably the most challenging question, because they give you a lot of questions, you don't know exactly which one they're going to ask, and they asked 6 or so. But one of the questions that she was very anxious about was, who is the Speaker of the House? And fortunately, at the time, she knew the answer to that one. So we are thrilled that this is her first presentation and appearance as now a US citizen. And mazel tov to you, and thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good morning. So that was funny. I didn't know that. I thought, thank you. I thought I would make this as conversational as possible, so I didn't write down what I wanted to tell you. I'll just tell you the story. I'm a journalist. I've been telling stories my whole life, and so I'll just use these notes to go through the story. I'm going to show you some photos, but then we will open to a conversation. So please, if you, while I'm telling the story, there's something you want to know more about, make a note, because there will be an opportunity afterwards for us to talk. And then afterwards, I'm happy to stay if you have any more questions or comments. So I'll explain first my connection to this book and to this story, and then I'll start from there. So I'm from Argentina. I was a reporter in Buenos Aires in 2003. I had just finished another book about a very important public figure in Argentina, a man named Jacobo Timerman, who became an international human rights figure in the 70s and 80s, and was an important and very controversial figure in Argentinian politics and journalism. And I had quit a job, and in Argentina there's very good severance laws, so I had some money in the bank, and sorry to say this, it's relevant to the story, and they had actually overpaid by mistake, and I had just realized that I had $5,000 that they didn't know they had paid me extra. The same day I was searching the internet, I was just looking for something completely different, but as I was Googling something, I saw this, when you Google that you see the titles that you can click. And there was this title that said, Converting Inca Indians in Peru. And, Converting Inca Jews in Peru. And I thought, that makes no sense, and I clicked. And this was a 3-page letter by a rabbi, Myron Zuber, from upstate New York, Monse, New York, a Hasidic town, upstate New York. I had no idea this town existed at the time, where he was asking for donations for this very strange Peruvian community led by a man, Segundo Villanueva, who had abandoned Catholic oppression and brought hundreds of people into Judaism, and they needed help. And so the letter, I knew later, was full of errors, and the story was embellished, and there were mistakes. But it was basically the story of this man that I will tell you about in a moment. And at the bottom of the letter, there was a phone number for people who wanted to donate. So if you wanted to donate money, you could call this number in upstate New York. I didn't want to donate money, but I was really intrigued. And out of an impulse, I ran to the phone and I called. A woman picked up. She immediately recognized an accent, and she switched into Spanish right away without even asking. And she told me she was the widow of the rabbi. The rabbi had passed. And she was one of the converts. The rabbi had helped them convert, and then he had married her. She was much younger, and he had recently passed. She sounded very happy, and she said, I can give you the phone number of Segundo Villanueva and his family. They are in Israel if you want to talk to them. So that's how I started. I took the money that I had now available to me. I thought this was a great coincidence. And I just bought a ticket to Israel, and I spent the next 2 weeks later, I was in Israel, and since then, I've been, going back and forth for years. It took me almost 15 years to finish the story because I had to go to Israel several times, to Peru many times, and then I will tell you why, to other countries in Latin America. So that's how I started. And another thing to tell you before I tell you the story is that, a lot of people, when they read the book, they ask me, why were you so interested in the story? Because, people assume originally, oh, maybe she's from Peru, and this is a story that was close to home. But no, she's from Argentina, so it's kind of confusing sometimes. So the story is, the main reason is that I'm a journalist, and I think I can see a good story when I see it. And I thought it was a really great story that was unique, almost an anomaly in Jewish history, but also hinted to a process that is ongoing now and new movements in the region. So I thought that was good enough. But there are some personal connections with my story. This was a community of Peruvians, people from South America who lived in a country where the majority of the population was Catholic. The Jewish community, I'll tell you more about that later, is very small in Peru. In Argentina, we have a very large Jewish community, but it's still a minority. I grew up as part of these two cultures. My mother is a Catholic from Paraguay. My father is a Jew, originally from Eastern Europe. I grew up closer to my father's family, but I was sent to nun school, to Catholic school. I abandoned religion and the church when I left high school. I don't have any great memories of my life as a Catholic. And I'm not a religious person, and I've done a lot of research about Judaism in Argentina, and I feel, very close to that part of my identity and my family. So there was a small personal connection that made me even more curious about how does this happen if you're in Peru, where Jews are 0.01% of the population. I think the size of the entire Jewish community in Peru is about the size of this congregation. It's 2,200 people or something like that. So that's how it started. And so what I did is I went to Israel, and then I just did the research, and it took me years. I wrote it in Spanish, but it was translated. The book you're going to read was translated by this wonderful translator, this Lisa Dillman, and it came out here this year. It's coming out in Spanish next year. So this is the story. The photo you're seeing is where the story begins. This is in Cajamarca. This is the north of the Peruvian Andes. Cajamarca is a very important place in the history of Latin America because it's the place in which the evangelization of South America started with the conquistadores in the 16th century. This is the place where the Inca Empire was ended, where the last Inca king was murdered, and where the Bible, this is the first place where the Bible arrived. This is where the arrival of the Bible took place in the 16th century. So the book actually starts with the scene in which the Bible gets there and what happens afterwards. 500 years later, not far from where this photo was taken, Segundo Villanueva was born. He was born in a hamlet I'll show you the house where he grew up, and he was born and grew up in a place called Rodacocha. This is not supposed to be moving. Well, if it goes on a loop, it will go on a loop. He grew up here in a very isolated hamlet in the Andes. Everyone around him was a Catholic. By the time he was born there in 1927, by that time, 92% of the Peruvian population was Catholic, and everyone around him was a Catholic. His father was a peasant, and when he was 17, his father was murdered by a neighbor, and the family, they had some land, and they lost everything they had. And the only thing Segundo got from his father was a Bible, a Protestant Bible, a Reina Valera 1909. So one of the, a Bible in Spanish that Protestant people read, that was hidden at the bottom of a trunk. There was no connection between their family and Protestantism. There were very few Protestant people in the country at the time. And so it was a mystery, and it still is a mystery, why that Bible, why the father had that Bible hidden at the bottom of this trunk. But this was Segundo's inheritance. And he was devastated by the fact that he had lost his father, and they had lost everything else. And at one point, as he was grieving, he opened this book, and he started to read this book. He had he knew how to read and write. He had gone to high school, so he was one of the most educated people in his family. But he opened this book as a book, so he started to read it from the beginning. This is not how Catholic and Protestants read the Bible, or like anyone reads the Bible. And so but he just opened it in the first page, and he read it. And he told his family and everyone else later about the emotion he felt when he did this first reading. And what he found in this first reading is it was a world that had no connection with anything he knew about. And there were truths in this book, he felt. And immediately he felt that it was God who was sharing this truth with him and talking to him through this book that he had never heard of. For example, there was this name, Israel, the people of God, and he had never heard about Israel before, and he read about El Sábado, the Sabbath, which was very moving to him because it was clear, and this would actually start the process that we're going to hear about now. He felt that there was this truth that had been hidden from people, and that he was finding it, and he had to do something with it. So his quest begins. This was Segundo's mother. That's Segundo when he was a young man. He was still a Catholic then. Let me see. This is Segundo in Cajamarca in the 1950s. And I think I have one more. And this is Segundo with his wife, also in the 50s. He was in his 20s then. So what happened then is that he started this quest that took his life, the rest of his life, where he dedicated almost every moment he had available to reread the Bible and to interpret what was written in these books. From the beginning, he knows he can't do this alone, and he needs people to discuss. So he creates these Bible reading groups, first with his brothers and cousins, and then with other people who are coming to the region. This is already by the late 40s, he's abandoned the Catholic Church, and he has his own Bible reading group. And there's this phenomenon that starts in the region that is a great coincidence for him. In the 50s is when the Protestant missions that had stayed away from the Latin American continent because it was already Christianized, because it was, the Catholic Church had the monopoly. Most Protestant churches had stayed away from the region. But then Mao came to China, and there was they were kicked out of China, all of these Protestant missionaries, and they need a new continent. So they started by the Andes. They started coming, and that actually started a complete religion transformation of the region. Now, the region, many countries in the region are no longer a monopoly of the Catholic Church. Now some of the countries are totally, a majority Pentecostal or Protestant or evangelical. But that was right at the beginning. And Segundo was there just, thirsty for somebody who knew more about the Bible, who could actually discuss it with them and help him understand. So he starts meeting with these groups who are arriving to Cajamarca, and after meeting with several pastors and groups, he finds the Seventh-day Adventists. Why were they so important to him? Because they were the only church he could find in all of Peru who also had paid attention to the Sabbath. And so they were also not celebrating, not keeping the Sunday, el Domingo, but el Sábado. So he decides they have the right interpretation, and they are the church that God wants. They are the ones who can really help him. So he joins them. He stays with them for a while, and then he joins a splinter. There's a splinter group that's called Reform, Seventh-day Adventist Reform, that are a bit more strict. They're completely vegetarian, for example. The women don't wear perfume. They are very conservative. They wear long. They cover their bodies. And this was a conservative guy, and he feels very comfortable with this group. And so he abandons, he joins them and he becomes part of this reform group. So 10 years go by, and he still has his parallel reading group where they still find that they can't get the answers to some questions. For example, they had seen that all these feast days described in Leviticus 23, they had read about the day of the new moon. They had read about so many other rituals that the Reform Adventist group did not keep or did not follow. And they could not get a straight answer from the priests, from the pastors. So at one point, this ends up in them abandoning this group. They decide they need to, they know now enough that they can search on their own. And they Segundo creates a new church. It's called Israel of God. This is a group photo for that church, just some of the people. It was a larger group. But he creates this church. One of the questions he has from the beginning is why, if the name of the people of God is Israel, there's no church called Israel. And so he feels that, he thinks that the people, the Israelites and the Jews from the Bible are extinct. He doesn't think they exist anymore. They think they are just in the Bible. And so he decides to create this church that is clearly missing, and because he's understanding the message. And he creates this group, Israel of God, that is basically still very close to the Adventist movement, but is starting this shift towards celebrating some of the feasts and keeping other rituals that they're reading about. They move to they decide that Cajamarca is very Christian, and it's very Catholic still, and the Protestant groups are rejecting them, so they can't find anyone that accepts them. They actually have unnerved a lot of people, and Segundo realizes they need to move away from this society, so they can really understand and be alone with the Bible and just live according to God's wishes or commands. And so they go to the Amazon jungle. This is a time in Peru, this is right before an agrarian reform in Peru, in which lots of people from the impoverished mountain towns are going to industrial cities. These are moments of industrialization, and also into the jungle, because in the jungle you can claim a piece of land and you don't have to pay for it. So you can just take the land and grow there. So this is what they do. This is, peasants from the mountains, very high in the Andes, go into this very hot, new jungle. They almost don't make it on the first expedition. Segundo is actually shot and almost killed. And they finally make it, but they see in every one of these obstacles another sign of God, that they're just doing the right thing. It's just they're gonna be tried. They're gonna be put, to trial. So they settle in the Amazon. This is 1967, and it's an interesting, just to pin that idea that they are becoming settlers in this land in 1967, and it connects with where they're going to end up in the end of their lives. So they think they've found the right church. They've created it. It's 50 people who go to the jungle. Then the rest of the community stays in Cajamarca because it's too hard for them, or they have jobs, or they have family members to take care of. They can move. And they live like that for a few years. And one day, Segundo keeps going to Lima, the capital of Peru, to find literature, to find Bibles, and there's the Biblical Society is there. They have every existing Bible for blind people, for children, with illustrations, for all of the translations into Spanish. By then, he has a library with every single possible, every single Spanish language Bible version, and they read from these Bibles. And they decide that, they decide that they've seen he's realized that there are some words, the vocabulary varies from one Bible to the other, but he doesn't make any of that. He just thinks different churches make these tweaks to the Spanish language version. And he knows, of course, the Bible is translated, but he doesn't make any he doesn't really think about that until he finds a pamphlet about Casiodoro de la Reina. Casiodoro was the first translator of the Bible into Spanish, right, during the beginning of the Reformation movement. And he reads the prologue to the first translated Spanish language Bible, in which the translator, Casiodoro de la Reina, says that he has had a lot of limitations to do this translation. He couldn't find all of the original Hebrew text for the Old Testament, and he hasn't used a lot of the Greek text for the New Testament, so he has used the Vulgata, which is the Latin version that the Catholic Church was using until, for a long time. This is a shock to Segundo. He realizes that, this is a person who's trying to get doing a literal reading of this text, and he realizes now that maybe there are errors that translators have. My translator friends love this story because there's this tension between translator and the original text, right? So Segundo gets, his entire kind of world is, shocked by this revelation, and he realizes he needs to get an original. He needs to get the true version of the Bible. So he goes to this biblical society, which is a Protestant institution, and he asks for a Hebrew Bible. For an original Bible, they'll tell him it's Hebrew, and they say they don't have one. He says, where can I find one? And they said, oh, just go to the Jews. And he's another revelation he's shocked about, and he says, the Jews, where are they? And they say 2 blocks away. And so he goes really around the corner. He does 2 blocks. And he knocks on the door of the Sephardic synagogue in Lima. Abraham Ben Amu is the rabbi, and he opens the door. He sees this man from the mountains. Peru, just supposed to say that Peru is a very, like every country, it has, divides, internal divides. And in Peru, it's class. And it's a society that was shaped by the Spanish conquest, still very much is, like most of the Andes, where a class system was created. So the native people were at the bottom, the Spanish were at the top, and then the mestizos, which is the connection between those two peoples, are kind of in the middle, and you are judged not just by the tone of your skin, but mostly by your status, by your economic status and the class you belong to. And these are 2 people from very different classes. So Segundo is an impoverished mestizo from the Andes, and Ben Amu is an immigrant, actually, to Peru. He came here to lead the synagogue, and he is struggling with a shrinking community. He's struggling with people there's a lot of intermarriage. There's been a lot of lack of oversight on conversions. Their conversions are actually not allowed. So people married Catholic women, and they decide they're Jewish, and their children are circumcised, and they grew up like Jews, and then they are buried in the Jewish cemetery. And he says that this is not according to, Allah. We cannot allow this to happen. And so he's kind of cleaning house a little bit and putting order here, just trying to bring some order and trying to get people engaged and get them to be, it's a very secular community. So he looks at this man with a lot of suspicion, and what does he want? Segundo tells him about his story and his family's, and he says that what he wants is to learn Hebrew. The rabbi says, oh, that's easy. I actually have, he had developed, a method. He has this table where you can actually, with the alphabet, where you can actually, with the pronunciation for Spanish, and he tells him to find a dictionary. Segundo says he needs more than that. He now needs to know about the Jewish people. And so the rabbi sends him to a bookstore and to the Jewish school, and Segundo gets a hold of a copy of Jewish Traditions and Customs, which is a thin book in Spanish that the bar mitzvah, when you prepare for the bar mitzvah, this is what you read. It's basically, traditions and a very simple explanation of traditions and customs. He reads this book in the bus back to the jungle. When he arrives in the jungle, he gathers his people, and he announced this great news, and it's that they are Jews. And he says, we're Jewish. This is exactly what I've been trying to, it all makes sense now. Everything connects now. And people are excited until he starts talking to them. They read the book, and they realize that the men need to get circumcised. And this had been a discussion. This is in the Bible, of course. Circumcision is not just in this booklet, right? They had spent years and years discussing whether circumcision is of the flesh or of the spirit. Because if you read the New Testament, St. Paul says, and this is the way Christianity was born out of Judaism, that actually, circumcision was required before Jesus died for our sins, and it's not required anymore. But circumcision is of the heart, is how the Bible, the New Testament explains it. So it's a covenant that you make. It's a spiritual covenant. You don't need to do anything to your flesh. And that was wrong. So they actually need to get circumcised. So this leads to a summit of the men of the Israel of God, of this church, where they discuss whether this is true or not. People have different opinions. And Segundo loses. And so he loses most of his people there. Men do not go through this kind of tested a limit to their faith. And he ends up leaving the jungle with just a small group of people who decide to follow him into Judaism. But most of the community stays in Israel of God as a Christian church. Then he moves away. He settles in the Pacific coast, and he spends the next 20 years living as Jews there, as the Jewish leader of this community. There are around 200 people at the end of these 20 years. And the way they learned is by reading this book, but they also get a hold of an abbreviated Shulchan Aruch, so the Code of Jewish Law, in Spanish language, an abbreviated version, and they learn how to live like that, and they follow it to the letter. So they just they learn all the prayers, they learn the rituals, how to wash their hands, etc. During those 20 years, they try again and again to be accepted by the local Jewish community in Lima. Most of the Jews of Peru were now in Lima. They were not in the provinces anymore for historical reasons that you can find out if you read the book. And they are almost everyone living in just a couple of upper middle class neighborhoods around a golf course. They have the story of a Jewish life in Peru is a story of success, economic assimilation and success, economic success. And they don't want to have anything to do with these peasants from the Andes and the jungle. And but some people within the community, including the rabbi who first met him, are very moved by them, and they see that they are more observant and than most Jews in Peru, and that it's been years and years, and they have not moved away from it. So some people start helping them, and there's a whole chapter of connections which I really enjoyed researching it, because it's how one man who gets really moved by meeting Segundo and his son goes to another person, and then they go to the Jewish agency, and then they go to the great rabbi in Israel, all the way from this, small, town in the Pacific coast in Peru. So at the end, there's this rabbi, Eliyahu Avihail. I don't know if anyone has heard of him. He was famous. He died recently, but he was famous in Israel. He was one of the last hunters of lost tribes in the world. Not hunters, seekers of lost tribes. So he has spent his life looking for the lost tribes. He was behind. He helped the Ethiopian immigration into Israel, and also he helped the Bnei Menashe, these groups that say from India and Pakistan who say they come from a lost Jewish tribe. And he spent his life looking for these tribes. And he knows they didn't get as lost as to get to Latin America, but he's moved. He says, well, they are interesting. I've never heard anything like them. So he sends an envoy, one of his students, to see them. Let me show you, so this is when they are living already as Jews in Trujillo. They create, this is after the agrarian reform, so they take land in the coast of, right next to the Pacific, in the coast of Peru, near a city called Trujillo, one of the largest cities in Peru. And they create a town they call El Milagro, the miracle. And this is one, this is the men in that, at that time. And their segundo is the second to the right in the middle. Let's see, oh, this is later. They are happy, and they don't need, Segundo never thought for a second that they needed acceptance. He wanted to be part of the Jewish community because they knew more and they could help him understand, and they knew how to follow, you know, the rituals, etc. But he didn't, and how to celebrate and how to keep the Sabbath properly, etc. But he doesn't think their acceptance is relevant to his, you know, determination and decision to become Jewish. Through this series of connections that they make, they realize that actually there are some rules, and if you were not born of a Jewish mother, you actually need to get converted. That's the only other option for them to be accepted, and that being accepted and being part of these people is actually a very important part of being Jewish. And so they start desiring this, and they know they can't have it in Peru, but they know they can have it in Israel. So that's why they, you know, all of these, you know, a lot of people tell them, you actually should move, you should be converted so that you can migrate, you can make Aliyah. And Abihail sends this man, Jonathan Segal, who was one of his students, and he meets them, and he gets really, he stays with them for 4 days, and he gets he's really moved by them, and he decides they need to help them, that it's just the right thing to do. So he goes back to Israel, and then it takes a few years. There's a series of more connections and lobbying the great rabbinate. And finally, a tribunal, Beit Din comes, a conversion tribunal comes to where they are, and they get converted. 195 people, the first wave. And so they have, you know, I thought at the beginning, when I started my story, this was the end of the story. This is when they are already in Israel. This is one of the first photos. Segundo, to the right, is meeting the local leaders and the people in the town where they are settled in Israel. This is 1990. And of all places in Israel, they are settled in a place called Elon Moreh. Elon Moreh is one of the first Jewish settlements in the West Bank. And after in the occupied territories, and they are part of this. They don't know this, but they are going to become now part of this movement that is fighting for land, you know, fighting the Palestinians for land, and fighting against the idea that, you know, all, you know, fighting for the idea of a greater Israel and having, you know, and taking the biblical land for the Jewish people. And they will learn when they arrive right after the first Intifada, sometime after the first Intifada begins. And they realize that they are part of, you know, something larger than just, you know, keeping, you know, with Jewish law, and more complicated. And so they are really well received. They completely assimilate. They live in caravans at the beginning, but then they're given houses in settlements all around it. And that was kind of the first ending to the story, which is intriguing, right? What would happen later? Then the story, and the story will do that, and you know, I've saved you from the loops, but the story does this. What they did, there's so many twists and turns to the story because it takes just so many elements and people and decisions, and it's just this process of understanding that takes a man's life, that takes the entire life of this man. So when they are there, the first thing that happens is that everyone in the community realizes that there's a lot of people who know more about Judaism, almost everyone, than Segundo does, even now. And so they abandon him as a leader. And even his children, his son, his firstborn, is now a rabbi in in Tel Aviv. And they all decide that they're very happy and that they can finally be Jewish and learn from rabbis and from other people who have been Jewish all their lives. And so he's kind of, he feels betrayed by his own community. And then the second thing that happens is that the local rabbis tell them they need to choose. They need to choose a congregation, they need to choose a synagogue, and Segundo finds this outrageous. And there's this moment, there's a meeting that's described in my book, where he and his son and his brother and other men are sitting with this rabbi, where the rabbi says, these are the options, we have these synagogues, we have these, there's different traditions, you need to pick. And Segundo's son complains and protests, and he says, we want the unity of the Jewish people. We don't want this. We don't want to have to choose. We just want it to be Jewish. And so Segundo gets more and more kind of disappointed at what he finds. He's not interested in the politics. He's not interested in being a settler necessarily. And he tries to get out. He can't. It's too late. He can't afford it. And so he's been ostracized. He's never learned Hebrew well enough to actually do what he wanted to do, which was to read the Bible in Hebrew. And he can barely, talk. So he's really ostracized. And he wants to keep doing what he's always done. He's a free thinker, and he wants to meet with other people who can interpret scripture with him. And he finds out about two groups in Israel, the Karaites, who only, don't believe in the oral law, only believe in the written Torah. And then they find the Samaritans, who are considered a sect, and by most people are not even considered Jewish. And there's, I think, 800 people who belong to 800 families who live there near where Segundo is settled. So he starts meeting with these people, and the rabbis don't take it, lightly. They say this man is a problem because he's not a real Jew, and he's still, what is he up to? He goes back to Peru, where the news have arrived that if you are Jewish and you actually go to Israel, you're given houses and you're given a stipend and you're given a better life than we have here. So now there's this opportunistic movement has started back in Peru by people who did not want to be circumcised originally, so stayed in Christianity, and now they've said, damn, we made the wrong choice. And they're trying to be converted. The rabbis don't take them seriously, but Segundo goes back to try to be their leader and to try to teach them to be Jewish the way he thinks you have to be Jewish. He's still very much a Jewish mind a Jewish man in his mind and heart. And people reject him. They realize he's not the best way to get to Israel, and so he's ostracized there too. So he goes back to Israel. They have to move out of Elon More. They move to another settlement called Tapuach, which is one of the most politically extremist settlements in the West Bank. And he dies there in 2008. He loses his mind first. He has dementia. By the time I met him, he was already lost in his mind. This was 2005. And in 2008, he died. And he got buried. This is him and his brother in Jerusalem. And that's him when he's already a settler. And this is for later. Close your eyes. June. I just want to show you this one. Okay, this is his grave or tomb in the Mount of Olives Cemetery. I was there in 2005 and took that photo. His new name, I don't know if you can read from there, but when he converted, he changed his name to Zerubbabel Tzidkiah. So it says here lays Zerubbabel Tzidkiah. Wait, don't look there. So that was the end of the story, right? So he died, and it's kind of a tragic ending, I think, for him, not for the community. The community is, his grandchildren don't speak Spanish now. They serve in the army. They're very much part of the, some of them serve in politics, and again, his son is a rabbi. But what happened after he died, and before he died and later, is that this opportunistic movement that has started in Peru grows. And some people are actually serious about it. And they keep the synagogue that Segundo had started to build. This is a photo of that, of the synagogue in El Milagro, this town where they became Jewish. And there's now hundreds of people waiting for conversion. And now there's a group of rabbis in Israel who are interested in getting them to settlements as part of the political local battle, demographic battle. So they are getting converted, and there's 300 more people who are converted in the following years and are now in the Gush Etzion area, so in the settlements closer to Jerusalem, and also around Ariel and other settlements in the north of the West Bank. This is one of the members of that community. Their name as a Jewish community was Bnei Moshe, so children of Moses. This is how Segundo called his community after abandoning the Israel of God church. This is the leader of the fourth wave of converts. He's now living in the Gush Etzion area. And this is the women those are photos that I took during my reporting. They were waiting for conversion. They were learning how this is a kitchen. They were learning about, how to cook and about, the seder and about, customs and things most houses have things like that, reminders. They had notes in the fridge to not mix milk and meat, etc. This is another member of the group and another family. So that's basic. So the epilogue of the story, because it doesn't end there either, is that it was not only happening in Peru. What happened was that at the same time that this was happening, there were other groups in at least 14 countries, according to my count, at least 60 communities in my directory that I assembled, that I created, who have abandoned Catholicism to become either evangelical or Pentecostal or other Protestant groups, and who are now coming into Judaism. So there's now in the region a whole emerging Jewish life. They're mostly impoverished people. They're mostly mestizos. They are, peasants and workers and cleaning ladies and, how do you say when you sell your things in the streets? Street sellers, no, vendors. Thank you, street vendors, and who have created their synagogues, who have learned from groups that are external groups that are now actually educating them and helping them. Most of them with the hope of getting to Israel. They were starting to go. Colombia is the most fertile place for that. I did a full other story about Colombia. There were 30 communities in Colombia. And in some cities like Medellin, a very big city in Colombia, the emerging Jewish community is much larger than the traditional Jewish community. And they have their own rabbis now. There's rabbis. People are going to Israel to be trained as rabbis, people from these communities, and they come back so that they can be the rabbis for their own groups. And in Medellin, if you ask about the rabbi, the normal citizen who's not Jewish, they will send you to the emerging Jewish community because they're very visible, and they're and the guy's on TV, and he teaches about kosher, and he's a prominent person in that community. So what's the end of the book for now, but as you see, this is something that just kind of began. Nobody knows where it's going, really, is that he was a pioneer, hence the title of the prophet. He never thought he was a prophet, but he was the pioneer, the first one in a movement that is now, kind of growing through the region. And because the desire for most of these communities, with some exceptions, was originally to go to Israel. And now the doors of Israel have been kind of closed because of the way that the more conservative Orthodox groups have taken over the decision of who gets to be accepted as a convert. And there's now those rules have become very strict. So most of these communities are now stuck in Latin America. There's no pathway to Israel at the moment. And some of them are growing, and some of them nobody knows whether they're just going to abandon the effort and just go back to Christianity, or are they going to, become something else? But it is part of a moment of a lot of transformation, and people. There's more people now in Latin America, and this is not. It's also happening in other regions, but in this case, it has this Jewish component, right? Who are gonna die in a religion different than the one in which they were born than at any other time in history. I mean, before, all the way back to the conquest, right? Because that's when the first kind of forced conversion in Latin America took place, when the Christians arrived. But since then, it was not possible for you to choose a different religion for most people than the one of your parents. And so this has opened a whole new phenomena that I think is fascinating. So that is the end of the story.
Thank you, Graciela. It is a fascinating story. I will tell you, it is a fascinating read as well. I was aware of, having studied in Israel several times, both during college and obviously for rabbinical school, there was always a large population. There is a very strong connection to Israel from the Jewish populations in Argentina and in Brazil, and those large, vibrant Jewish congregations. In fact, one of the largest, if not the largest, seminary outside of the United States is in Buenos Aires. Yes. And certainly, if any of you have ever been to like B'nai Jeshurun in New York City, has had Argentinian and Roli Matalon. But it's so fascinating because it's not necessarily what we would expect. And you talked about we laughed about this when we were speaking earlier beforehand. And when you asked me the size of the congregation, yes. And I said, we're about 2,200 families. And she said, that is the size of the Jewish population of the entire country of Peru. But it's a fascinating story, and especially in how you start, because you do paint this picture that took me back to history class in elementary school and learning about the Incas and origin stories. And origin stories are very popular these days. And so I'm wondering, curious about why you start back there, right, with 15th, 16th century Peru. Yes. And that first, tell us a little bit more, you alluded to it, that first Bible.
Yeah, right, thank you. Yes, so the book starts when this Spanish conquistadores arrived in Cajamarca, what I mentioned at the beginning when I show you the first photo, and why I thought it was really important. I realized when I was figuring out how to write the book that one of the main protagonists of my book was the Bible. The Bible is what, it's segundo, but it's the Bible talking to him. And as an Argentine and an admirer of Jorge Luis Borges, one of our major writers, at one point I thought, this is such a Borgian story. This is the man who is captured by this book, and he's lost in the labyrinths of this book, and the book creates the reality for him. Since he starts reading, he starts understanding the world through this book, and he keeps this book. There's one, the book is full of scenes and moments that I thought were just so amazingly moving in some cases, but also so literary. He, at one point, when he decides that the Bible is not, that they're going to be Jewish, and that the New Testament is a lie, or it's just it's not part of the Bible. They do something they call the circumcision of the Bible. They circumcise their Bibles. All the families gather, they cut this Protestant Bible, and they remove the New Testament, and they bury the New Testament because they've loved this book. They can't destroy it, and so there's so many other moments in which the Bible is just one. It's a character in the book. So I thought that this was the story needed to be told linearly, because it's you need to understand how it starts to understand how then he goes from here to there, and from and how he gets all the way there. So that was simple, but I think we need to start with with introducing the first character, which is the Bible that he reads first, which is this Spanish language Protestant Bible, and how the first version of a Bible arrived to Peru, and the fact that it had arrived in Cajamarca, which is his town, so where he was born, in that house that that little shack that I showed you, that was the closest city was Cajamarca, and that's the region of Cajamarca, and this is where the conquistadores arrived, because that's where the Inca, king at the time was located, and so it's not, you're not going to have to go through, pages and pages of that history. It's a very brief description, but I thought it's such a dramatic scene, and it's so fundamentally, kind of foundational for Latin America as we know it, that I thought I needed to start from there. Yeah.
Thank you. The other piece that was very Latin American focused was they go into the Amazon, and these are not farmers or they really are, they're lost in the Amazon. It's almost like they have to get lost to find themselves, to find their Judaism, but the idea that they were propelled to go to really isolate themselves, and it was many days' journey to get there, and then they kind of gave up on that, and I don't know if that was a successful piece of the journey, but along the way it seems as though Segundo had a number of experiences, as you spoke about, that he was seeking something. Right. I mean, he was seeking throughout his journey, and it's not so surprising that he really found himself aligned with the Karaites, who are Jews who are Torah-itic Jews. They really are focused just on the Torah, on the Tanakh, but not on the later commentaries. But he was really on this journey of seeking. And did he ever really find what he was looking for? I know the community did, but did he?
Right, that's a really great question. And that's that's a major theme in the book. So this is another, reason why I felt this story so compelling, and forgive me for making the question the answer for giving you to start with such a small answer. But as a journalist, truth seeking is also our business. So finding the truth is really hard, because you have a lot of limitations as a human. You weren't in the place, you weren't in the room in which it happened. You were not, and you have only access to your experience. You don't have access necessarily to other points of view, other experiences, etc. So the fact that this man, and this is one of the things I thought so extraordinary about Segundo, that he was just so determined to find the truth, and that he really thought there was a truth to begin with, and that he keeps finding it, and then realizing it wasn't. He needed to keep on looking, because he could never really get the whole. It was kind of something that you grab and then escapes you, and then you realize, no, wait, it wasn't this. So there's more. I have to keep looking, and the fact that he did this intellectually and internally, because there's no really a lot of I'm assuming you noticed that the book is not told as we don't really get to know Segundo psychologically the way in a novel you know somebody, where you know what you feel, because the point of the book and his story for me was the actions that he's taking, because he's looking, but he's doing at the same time. So there's all these actions and and it's a constant conversation. It's always communal, right? It's never. He doesn't think he can get to the truth alone, and he's looking for this. And every time he finds, and then he loses people in the journey, because people say, no, wait, we had already found the truth. Why you keep moving? And to him, and I know he was never done. He would have continued if he had lived 500 years. He would still be looking.
I can only imagine too for him, from the beginning, his first followers were his brother and his cousin.
Right.
And, and then to have them, he's a little bit like Abraham in that sense. Like, he can go anywhere if he has them with him, and then at the end, his family sort of abandons, and he's still searching. He's not satisfied with the answer. But what's also so fascinating about the epilogue, and the idea that there are a number of these communities. I had no idea that there were all these communities that are sort of on the verge of, they haven't gone through conversion and they're seeking. And one of the things that was so fascinating about that is that they, some of them, reading it, he has, Segundo has a very, he's trying to figure it out. And he has certainly some, close ties to Christianity, and he's trying to make sense of all of it and what's been taught and what's been passed down. And I was really interested in this idea that there are, in some of the communities in Colombia, who might have been considered Messianic Jewish communities, which are not Jewish communities, but they realize this is absurd. You can't be, Messianic Judaism is not Judaism.
Right.
And how do they get to that if they, all these communities are trying to find someone to teach them, and because of what you talked about with class, which was a really important piece, almost another protagonist of the story, because of the issue of class, rabbis weren't willing to work with them. Others in the Jewish community, they kept getting pushed away and more isolated, yet they keep coming back.
Yes.
Why do they keep coming back?
So, there's no just one kind of blanket answer for all of them, but for most of the people who are now seeking, who are still in Latin America, those who arrived who got to this, process for opportunistic reasons, just as an escape to poverty. I just want to say, I don't know what your positions are on immigration, but I'm an immigrant, and I'm a privileged immigrant, but it's really hard, even if you're a privileged immigrant, and I did leave a country so that my child could have a better life. So I pass no judgment on those people who, kind of embarked on this process as a way of escaping poverty and using conversion as a step. I describe what they do. I'm not judgmental of them, and I certainly don't condemn them. But a lot of those people have abandoned it because it's not working. It's been decades already, 20 years. But what happened is that, becoming one thing that I thought fascinating, even with the groups who started this process as, again, an opportunistic movement to leave Peru, was that because being Jewish is not just so if you convert to evangelical, it's inside your heart. Nobody can see. There's no difference. You can lie about. You can just say, there are prisons in Latin America that are run by evangelicals, and they are safer. So a lot of prisoners from other people who are in jail or in prison in other normal prisons convert to evangelical Christianity, so they can be moved to these evangelical prisons, because they are going to be safer, and the churches will take care of their families. And I always thought, so they just have to say it, and they pray. Nobody can tell. You can really fake it. But being Jewish, the way these people, approach it, you cannot fake. So by the time, 10 years go by, if you've been faking it for 10 years, at the time of those 10 years, you're just not the same person. You're already, you've been circumcised. If you're a man, you're kosher. You are, you've done all of these efforts. They're all also very, they were Orthodox. They changed the way they dressed. They changed the way they learned Hebrew. They've learned all these prayers. Their children are taught, since they're little, about this life. And, so by the time they've done it for 10 years or 20 years, they are that, they're not. So a lot of people kind of stayed because this is their identity now, and there are some groups. There's a lot of the Messianic piece you said. In Latin, some of these groups went through the Messianic Judaism as a transition point. That's the story of the Colombian ones, of the Colombian groups that I wrote about. So they did, Catholicism. Then they moved to Pentecostal and evangelical, another Protestant movement. Then they found Messianic Judaism, and then they realized it wasn't Judaism, and some of them kind of moved on another step. It's like going backwards in the Bible, right? So they go from the New Testament back. So it really depends. There's very different groups. There are some commonalities. There's many, but then some people have immigrated individually, and they found kind of loopholes, and they are now Israelis.
And that was the other piece that when they realized, I think Segundo was surprised that they actually had to convert. They had to do something. He felt like he was already there. It was, you know, that circumcision of the heart, and not just the circumcision piece, but really that there had to be a conversion and finding a rabbi, and that had to become a change in who that rabbi was in the community to be able to actually take that on and convert this whole community. Really, a really amazing story. So I encourage people to read it. It is like reading one of your wonderful articles in the New Yorker or the Atlantic, and just going through, and each layer is just so beautifully shared. And yet, as you talked about, you don't quite get into the psyche of how they were feeling, what they were thinking, but really a fascinating story. I do want to pause and give a chance if anyone has some questions, as I know always, as we talked about, there would be.
That's great.
Yep, Chuck, please.
I just have two prosaic questions.
Please.
The first one was when Segundo first started and converted and they moved, and they had their kind of congregation and they moved. How are they supporting themselves? That's the first question. And the second question is, among the countries in South America that have these groups of Jews, is there any networking, either internally among themselves or externally from Israel?
Right. Thank you. So they supported themselves first when they were in Cajamarca. Segundo was a carpenter, and they lost the land, and so they moved to the city. And he was a carpenter because he could close the shop on Saturdays, and he could do whatever he wanted with the. So, and then other people there were street vendors. They had those jobs. There were a lot of, some people were still peasants in the mountains and would go, but most people were street vendors, or some of them, when they start joining the churches, the Protestant churches, some of them go to work for the churches, selling Bibles, for example. And then when they go to the jungle, they become, they live very poorly. I mean, they were poor. When they go to the jungle, they become, campesinos, so they start selling their produce, and it's very hard. They basically live with what they have. They eat what they grow, and they sell a little. But one of the reasons they ended up leaving, everyone ended up leaving at the end, was it was just too hard, and they couldn't make a living, or it was just barely. And the second one, no, there's no. So the network, that's a very interesting question, because there was an Israeli organization that was effectively that network. It's called Shavei Israel. It's the continuation of the organization created by Abihail, who was the lost tribe seeker. He had a mentee who worked for the first Netanyahu government in communications, Michael Freund, a New Yorker who's a millionaire, and who had moved to Israel. He became part of the Netanyahu administration, and then he found this organization. He took over and he recreated it as Shavei Israel. Shavei Israel is now not looking just for the lost tribes. They took over that movement, but also any other person in the world willing to convert and be made a settler. So for these, and there's a lot about that in the book. This man running this organization, he said he had a political agenda, which was to fight the demographic, unevenness of Israel and the region, that he didn't, he was just after that. And so he started, when he learned about these groups in Latin America, he started investing in sending rabbis, most of them religious Zionists from the groups that he supported, to different places in Latin America to really prepare people for conversion so that they were ready. And at one point, until a couple of years ago, they had a lot of political power. He had political power, and so he got people to convert. Then he lost that, with the changes in government. It's just, in the past years, he lost that those connections, and then he had a really bad divorce. And his former wife, this is also in the book, who also has a fortune of her own because her father was also a millionaire, sued him because she found that he had stolen money from his father's inheritance to fund Shavei Israel. So Shavei Israel is now in trouble. So they kind of stopped. But I don't know what's going to happen next. Yes. Hi.
Thank you. The story was well told and very poignant individually. I'm just interested in sort of the historical background of how Jews got to South America. I assume during the Spanish Inquisition and conversos,
Yes.
was there a stream from a Spanish-speaking country to South America of Jews during that? I know the Holocaust, obviously,
Right.
from Eastern Europe, but
Right.
before that?
Yes, you'll find some of that in the book. So there were different moments and different kind of historical waves. And there were the conversos or anusim who arrived during the Conquista. And there's all these stories, I'm sure you've read about them or seen movies about them, some of stories of communities who were hidden Jews, and then 400 years later, they realized that they've been lighting candles in secret, Friday nights, and that's why they were, So they are not, these people, these communities that I'm writing about, they do not claim any converso past. They have no connection. Well, Shavei Israel actually, because they know that story, they try to manufacture that connection to get the process expedited and more successful. So they actually wrote this book that's called Tienes Raíces Judías, Do You Have Jewish Roots? That tells people in these communities that if everyone in their family is called Anabela, then they're probably Jewish, because that was a converso name 500 years ago, and maybe that explains it. So they've been trying to manufacture that connection. It is a legitimate, real, genuine connection for many communities in the region. And there's some historical records of conversos arriving to Peru by the time the story begins in the book, in the 16th century, to Celendín, which is an area very close to Cajamarca. And there's actually one moment when Segundo learns this history later on, when he's already Jewish. He learns about this history, and he sends his brother to go to Celendín to try to find the Jews there. And the brother comes back saying, Alvaro is the name of his brother. He comes back saying, they're just Peruvians. I couldn't find any Jews. And so that's one wave, and that's a very important part of kind of initial moment of Jewish life in the region. But then most, the kind of modern traditional Jewish life arrived in the late 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. That's how my father's family, arrived in Argentina. You would take a boat to America. We always joke that they took the wrong boat because, it could be New York, it could be, Buenos Aires, and they just, they didn't know what they were doing. And so, those are kind of the Argentinian Jews are most of the, current population come from those waves in the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s. And it's before the Holocaust, right? My family came there escaping pogroms, so.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. I was hoping you could speak more about what feels like a little bit of a dark political undercurrent, right? And you mentioned the 1967 connection, right, in Peru, but then obviously that is when the occupied territories, right, became occupied, if you will. And talking about, and of course this organization, Shavei Israel, is very much illustrative, right, of this political agenda. And curious if you could elaborate a bit more about this enthusiasm for these communities, and of course settling them in occupied territories and what that means politically.
Well, that, as you probably know, that is very controversial in Israel. And there's a whole chapter in the book when they arrived, how the Israelis and the Israeli press sees this. When they arrived, remember, they arrived in early 1990. That's when the Russians, the Soviets, the former Soviet Union Jews are arriving in throngs. There were days where 10,000 people arrived from the former Soviet Unions. And so and that's already a big, controversy in Israel. So they are covered by mainstream media in Israel, and as part of that, kind of process in which this change, so who is a Jew now, who gets to get Israeli citizenship, are these people, a lot of these people were not, are not observant or are not Jewish by any, they have a grandfather, so, the law of return, all of that is being discussed when they arrive. And the fact that they are taken to the settlements is an extra, layer of, controversy, because, the other movement is not connected to the settlements. They were not that many, so at the beginning it wasn't so. There was some coverage, but then when more people were starting, Shavei Israel started getting more people there, including trying to get the name Menashe from India and Pakistan, and it became all part of that. That very complicated and charged political debate. For them, it was interesting because most of the B'nai Moshe, the community who that Segundo created, who emigrated, who made Aliyah, and who settled there, most of them have completely accepted and embraced the settler movement and identity, and the view on the Palestinians and who those lands belong to. Segundo never really did. He was not invested in that. He had no interest in that, and he thought it wasn't safe to be. There's a whole chapter also of some of these Peruvians who emigrated with him. The converts were killed or shot during confrontations with Palestinians. So he's afraid at one point, or there's this idea that he's afraid, and that's why he wants to leave. So. Again, the book is, I try to, and some people didn't like this, but I tried not to, I don't want to tell people what they need to think. I feel, everyone is smart and they can think, and they have their own lived experiences and their own ideology, their own political. So every book I've written, I just hope that, the reader will come up with their own judgment, but I won't tell you what to think. I won't tell you what I think about it. I won't give you my, I do have them, but I won't give you my political views because I think they will be in the way, and there's no need for that at all. So I think if you read, the whole kind of last third of the book is their life as settlers, and there's a lot of their interactions with the other groups, their interactions with Kahane, Meir Kahane. How do you pronounce Kahane? Kahane. In English. There's, the different views of the people, what happens internally in relationship with what's happening in Israel.
Spoken like a true journalist. Also, thank you.
I try.
Hi. This is interesting to me because I lived in Peru for about a year, from 2007 to 2008, and I became friends with some people in the conservative Jewish community, which growing up Reform felt orthodox to me.
Guillermo Bronstein? You know Guillermo Bronstein?
Did what?
Do you know Guillermo Bronstein?
No.
Guillo? Okay, sorry.
No.
He's the rabbi of the conservative synagogue now.
Well, he might be the rabbi. I was learning Spanish, so there was a lot that I didn't understand when I would go to temple there. But what was happening at that time was the people I was getting to know were telling me about another synagogue that was in this very small Jewish community in Lima that was estranged from the synagogue that I was involved with. And this other synagogue was characterized as having less status. And from what you're describing, there's this movement going on in the country. And I'm just wondering, with the financial pressures now in Peru, do you think that the Jews are becoming more divided, or if maybe they're coming more together? Because they seemed pretty divided, when I was there, like in 2007, 2008.
So I think you need to add, this is just not just Peru, but this is a moment of polarization almost everywhere, here, there. Peru has gone through a very, difficult years of political turmoil. They had I don't know how many former presidents in jail. They just lost one president after a year. So the country is very divided politically, and it has, there's layers of division, the class, economic, and now political, and the Jewish community is not kind of is part of that same landscape. So I've seen the visions are now more political, and who supports who. Was Fujimori really such so bad? Maybe some people are thinking, was Castillo, who was the former president, was to the left. And what I've noticed going, and I have a lot of friends there, is that some people are just like here and like in Argentina and in so many places, people are moving to getting more extreme to the end, personally, like ideologically, becoming more radical politically, like to the right and to the left in their ideas and views. So I think that is probably what you noticed. And then there are some of these groups in Lima, in Los Olivos. It's in the suburbs. I mean, not in the suburbs, in the rings around the city that are, mostly occupied by, like slums around the city. And there are some groups there, and, the local traditional groups don't want to have anything to do with them. And even groups like the conservative synagogue, the 1870 is the name of the synagogue, they are the only one that does, they convert, they do conversions. They're the only group accepting conversions in Peru and actually performing conversions or doing conversions. And they used to be closer and be very welcoming to some of these groups, and they have now become more wary.
Thank you. I know there may be other questions, and I know that Graciela is happy to answer those following conclusion in just a few moments. She'll be signing books out at the table, so you can certainly ask her, and she'll stick around a little bit for other questions people might have. But I just want to thank Graciela Mochkofsky, practiced many times, for being with us today, but also for the years of research and work that you put into this. Are you working on anything now?
I'm running a graduate school of journalism.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
And becoming an American citizen.
Exactly.
And mazel tov on that again. We're excited to be your first stop on that part of your
Yes.
journey. Thank you to Graciela Mochkofsky and to the Jewish Book Council.